The morning mist hung low over the Grafenwohr training grounds in Bavaria, clinging to the frost-covered grass like a reluctant ghost. Major Heinrich Steiner stood with his arms crossed, his breath forming small clouds in the November air of 1945. 7 months had passed since Germany's surrender, 7 months since the world he'd known had crumbled into ash and memory. Now he wore no uniform, just civilian clothes that hung loose on his frame, a frame that had once been filled out by regular Wehrmacht rations, but had since diminished under the austere conditions of the occupation. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Beside him stood Colonel James Mitchell of the United States Army, a compact man with steel-gray eyes and the weathered face of someone who'd seen combat across 2 continents. Mitchell consulted his watch, then gestured toward the far end of the range where American soldiers were setting up equipment. "You're going to want to see this, Major," Mitchell said, his German accented but serviceable. "Your people thought the Panzerfaust was the pinnacle of infantry anti-armor capability. We're about to show you something that changes the calculation." Heinrich said nothing, his jaw tight. The Panzerfaust had been Germany's answer to Soviet tanks, a shoulder-fired weapon that had given ordinary infantry soldiers the power to destroy armored vehicles. It had a range of about 30 meters for the early models, 60 for the improved versions, and against all odds, it had worked. He'd seen it work, had used it himself during the desperate final months when the Eastern Front collapsed and the Western Allies pushed across the Rhine. 3 other former Wehrmacht officers stood with Heinrich, each representing different branches of the defunct German military. There was Captain Ernst Weber, an artillery specialist whose left arm ended at the elbow, a souvenir from a Soviet shell near Kursk. Next to him, Lieutenant Friedrich Hartmann, younger than the rest, barely 23, who'd spent the last year of the war as a Panzerfaust instructor. And finally, Major Klaus Dietrich, a panzer commander whose tank had been destroyed 3 times, who'd survived each time through what he claimed was nothing but dumb luck. The Americans had assembled them here for what they called a technical demonstration. It was part of the denazification and re-education program, though Heinrich suspected it was also about humiliation, showing the defeated Germans just how outmatched they'd been, how their vaunted technology and tactical doctrine had been surpassed. Downrange, American soldiers finished their preparations. Heinrich could see tripods being set up, equipment being carefully positioned. The morning sun was burning away the mist, revealing the full expanse of the training ground. Target vehicles had been positioned at various distances, old German equipment, Heinrich noted with a pang. A Panzer IV at 100 meters, a Stug 3 assault gun at 200, and farther back, almost invisible in the distance, what looked like a Panther tank at 300 meters. "The M18 recoilless rifle," Colonel Mitchell said, pulling out a small notebook. 57mm bore, rifled barrel, fires a shaped charge projectile. Development started in 1943, production began in late 44. We've been using it in the Pacific theater, but it would have been quite effective in Europe had the war continued. "Recoilless?" Ernst Weber muttered, his interest evident despite his obvious desire to remain impassive. "How?" "Balanced recoil," Mitchell explained, warming to his subject. "When the round is fired, gas is vented backward through the breech. The forward force of the projectile is balanced by the backward force of the gas. Net recoil is effectively 0, which means a much lighter weapon than a conventional gun of similar power." Heinrich studied the weapon as American soldiers wheeled it into position. It looked almost fragile compared to the heavy anti-tank guns he was familiar with. A long tube mounted on a tripod, with what appeared to be a peculiar ventilated breech. 2 men operated it, one as gunner, one as loader, though Heinrich suspected a single trained soldier could manage it alone in a pinch. Your Panzerfaust, Mitchell continued. Effective range of 30 to 60 meters, depending on the model. This weapon, he paused for effect, effective range of 450 meters against armored targets. Maximum range over 4,000 meters for area targets. The numbers hit Heinrich like a physical blow. 450 meters, 7 times the range of even the improved Panzerfaust, and from a weapon that looked barely heavier than a man could carry. You're claiming your weapon can destroy our... Friedrich Heimann caught himself. Can destroy German heavy armor at nearly half a kilometer? I'm not claiming it, Lieutenant, Mitchell said. We're about to demonstrate it. The American crew had loaded the weapon now. The gunner dropped into position behind it, adjusting his sight picture. An officer with a radio called out range and wind information. Heinrich found himself leaning forward despite his determination to appear unimpressed. The command echoed across the range. Fire! The M18 recoilless rifle made a distinctive double crack, the initial explosion and the sound of the gas venting backward. Heinrich watched the projectile's vapor trail arc toward the Panzer IV at 100 meters. The impact was instantaneous and devastating. The shaped charge punched through the tank's frontal armor, and a gout of flame erupted from the turret hatch. Penetration at 100 meters, Mitchell announced. Now watch. They reloaded quickly. Heinrich timed it at perhaps 15 seconds and traversed to the Stug 3 at 200 meters. Another shot, another perfect hit. The assault gun's thick frontal armor, designed to defeat direct fire from enemy tanks, proved no match for the American weapon. At 200 meters, Mitchell said, conversationally, as if discussing the weather rather than the destruction of armored vehicles, your Panzerfaust would have been completely ineffective. The warhead wouldn't have had the velocity to guarantee penetration even if it could reach the target. The third shot targeted the Panther tank at 300 meters. This time, Heinrich held his breath. The Panther had been Germany's answer to the T-34, with sloped armor that could defeat almost any Allied tank gun at medium range. Its frontal armor was 80 millimeters and angled at 55 degrees, equivalent to about 140 millimeters of vertical armor. The M18 fired. The Panther's turret rang like a bell, and flame gouted from every seam and opening. 300 meters, Mitchell said quietly, and we could have engaged it at another 150 meters beyond that with reasonable probability of a kill. Heinrich felt something shift inside him, a fundamental recalculation of everything he thought he'd known about infantry tactics and the balance of power on the battlefield. The Panzerfaust had been a revelation, a weapon that gave individual soldiers the capability to destroy tanks that would otherwise have been untouchable. But it required getting close, required courage bordering on suicidal as soldiers closed to within spitting distance of machines specifically designed to kill infantry. This American weapon, it changed everything. A squad equipped with M18 recoilless rifles could engage armor from positions that were relatively safe, from ranges where enemy machine guns and coaxial weapons would be ineffective. They could set up on high ground, in buildings, behind cover that would have been useless for Panzerfaust teams who needed to be nearly on top of their targets. I see the implications are sinking in, Mitchell observed. He wasn't gloating, Heinrich noted. If anything, the American colonel seemed almost sympathetic. Imagine what would have happened if we'd deployed these in significant numbers during the Battle of the Bulge. Your panzer columns couldn't have approached Allied positions without running into mutually supporting teams of these weapons, each covering the other's sectors of fire, all able to engage your armor from ranges where your tanks couldn't effectively suppress them. Klaus Dietrich, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was rough, scarred by years of shouting over tank engines and explosions. "How much does it weigh?" 45 pounds for the weapon, Mitchell answered. "Projectile weighs about 2¾ pounds. A 3-man crew can carry the gun and 24 rounds without vehicle support." "Scheisse," Klaus muttered. A standard Panzerfaust weighed about 11 pounds and was single-use. The American weapon was heavier, yes, but reusable, more accurate, with vastly greater range, and a 3-man crew could carry enough ammunition to engage an entire platoon of tanks. "The penetration mechanism?" Ernst Weber asked, his artillery officer's mind clearly working through the technical specifications. "Shaped charge, like your Panzerfaust, but more refined. The cone is precision manufactured, the explosive carefully formulated. Penetration is consistent across the weapon's effective range. The round has a muzzle velocity of about 1,200 feet per second, which means minimal ballistic drop at combat ranges, and a flat enough trajectory that range estimation isn't as critical as with mortar or artillery fire." Friedrich Hartmann was shaking his head slowly. "We trained men that the key to successful anti-tank warfare was getting close without being detected, using terrain and rubble for concealment, waiting until the last possible moment. We told them they were heroes, that their sacrifice was necessary." His voice caught slightly. "And you're telling me you had a weapon that made all of that unnecessary?" "Not just us," Mitchell said. He gestured, and another group of American soldiers brought forward additional equipment. "The British have their own version, the Ordnance RCL 3.45-inch. The Soviets captured several of our M18s and have already begun reverse engineering them. Within 5 years, every major military in the world will have recoilless rifles. The tactical paradigm you understood, where armor dominated the battlefield and infantry had to make desperate close-range attacks, that paradigm is over." The second demonstration involved firing positions in tactical employment. The Americans set up multiple M18s in a defensive line, showing how they could create overlapping fields of fire. They demonstrated firing from inside buildings, from behind earth berms, from defilade positions where the gun could engage targets without exposing the crew. They showed how quickly the weapon could be displaced, how 2 men could carry it at a run for short distances, how it could be broken down for transport through difficult terrain. Each demonstration was a knife in Heinrich's understanding of warfare. The Panzerfaust had seemed like such an innovation, such a game-changer. German soldiers had knocked out thousands of Allied tanks with them, had stopped Soviet advances, had made armor advances costly and dangerous. But they'd done it at tremendous cost in German lives, because getting close enough to use a Panzerfaust meant exposing yourself to every weapon the enemy possessed. The M18 rendered that sacrifice largely unnecessary. It gave infantry the ability to kill armor from distance, with accuracy, with enough ammunition capacity to engage multiple targets. It was sustainable, in a way the single-use Panzerfaust could never be. It was, Heinrich realized, the weapon Germany would have needed to develop if the war had continued, if they had the resources and time and industrial capacity to think beyond desperate measures. "I want you to understand something," Colonel Mitchell said, as the demonstration concluded. The American crews were breaking down their equipment, loading it onto trucks. "We're showing you this not to humiliate you, but because you need to understand the world you're living in now. The war is over. Germany will rebuild, but the military balance has shifted fundamentally." He pulled out a map, spreading it on a folding table that had been set up. It showed Europe, with the Soviet occupation zones marked in red, the Western Allied zones in blue. The alliance that defeated Germany is fracturing. The Soviets are consolidating their hold on Eastern Europe. They're not going to leave. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, they're building a buffer zone, an empire in all but name. And they're doing it with the largest army in Europe, an army that's been fighting continuously for 4 years, that's learned combined arms warfare and operational maneuver from the hardest teacher possible, the Wehrmacht. Heinrich and the other German officers leaned closer, their interest shifting from the weapons demonstration to this unexpected political briefing. "You're telling us this because," Klaus asked carefully. Fraternization with the Americans was forbidden, discussing politics even more so. They could all be punished just for this conversation. "Because the Americans and British are going to need Germany. Not immediately, but eventually. We're going to need a barrier against Soviet expansion. We're going to need industrial capacity. We're going to need soldiers who know how to fight the Russians because they've already done it. But we're going to need a Germany that understands it can't go back to the old ways." He tapped the display area where the M18s were being loaded. The era of German military innovation being ahead of everyone else, that's over. You had good weapons, good tactics, good operational doctrine. But you didn't have the industrial base to sustain a long war against opponents who could outproduce you 10-1. The M18 recoilless rifle is just one example of dozens of weapon systems we developed during the war. We have the resources to try multiple approaches, to test and refine and deploy at scale.
"So this is a recruitment pitch," Ernst Weber said bitterly. "You want us to work for you against the Soviets." "Not yet," Mitchell corrected. "Right now, you're all on restricted status, subject to denazification procedures, prohibited from military activity. That will continue for years. But in 5 years, 10 years, the world will look different. The question is whether you'll be ready to be part of it, or whether you'll be stuck in the past, dreaming of bygone glory that was never quite as glorious as memory makes it seem." Heinrich studied the American colonel, trying to read the man's intentions. Mitchell was being remarkably candid, perhaps more candid than his superiors would approve if they knew the details of this conversation. Was this an official policy, a carefully planned recruitment approach, or was Mitchell operating on his own initiative, seeing a future that others in the occupation authority hadn't yet recognized? "You said within 5 years everyone would have recoilless rifles, including the Soviets." "They already have prototypes. They captured enough examples in Manchuria during their invasion of Japanese-held territory. Stalin has ordered crash development. By 1948, every Soviet rifle division will have recoilless guns at the regimental level. By 1950, they'll have improved versions at the battalion level. The weapons will get lighter, more powerful, more accurate." "And if Germany is to have any military capacity at all," Heinrich said, completing the thought, "we'll need to be training on these weapons now, learning their capabilities and limitations, developing doctrine for their employment." "Exactly. Which brings me to the real reason you're here today." He pulled out another document, this one official-looking, with stamps and signatures. "The Occupation Authority is establishing a technical advisory group to study Soviet military developments and recommend countermeasures. It will be staffed primarily by former Wehrmacht officers with Eastern Front experience. The group will have access to intelligence reports, captured equipment, and American technical specifications. It will be civilian in nature, purely advisory. You would be subject to ongoing denazification review, your work would be monitored, and you would have no command authority whatsoever." Heinrich felt his heart rate increase. They were being offered a lifeline, a way back to relevance, to purpose. After 7 months of feeling useless, of watching Germany lie prostrate while the victors decided its fate, this was an opportunity to do something meaningful. "Why us?" Klaus Dietrich asked suspiciously. "There are thousands of former officers, many with better credentials, higher ranks." "Because your records show exactly what we need," Mitchell said. He pulled out files. Heinrich realized with a shock that they were personnel records, detailed assessments of each man's service. "Major Steiner, you commanded a Panzerjäger battalion on the Eastern Front from 1942 to 1944. You developed innovative defensive tactics using combined Panzerfaust and machine gun teams. Your unit had one of the highest kill ratios against Soviet armor in your sector." He turned to the next file. Captain Weber, your artillery regiment provided fire support for mobile defensive operations during the retreat from Ukraine. You wrote a tactical paper in early 1945 on integrated anti-tank defense that was circulated to corps level before the collapse. Lieutenant Hartmann, you ran Panzerfaust training for replacement battalions. You developed a teaching method that reduced training time by 40% while actually improving first-shot hit probability. Your students had better survival rates than those trained by conventional methods. And, Major Dietrich, you survived the destruction of 3 tanks while maintaining combat effectiveness. You're one of the few panzer commanders who successfully adapted to operating in an environment of Allied air supremacy and overwhelming firepower. Your after-action reports show clear tactical thinking and willingness to innovate under pressure. Mitchell closed the files. You're not the highest-ranking officers available. You're not even the most decorated, but you're survivors who proved capable of learning and adapting. You understand that tactics must evolve to match technology. And most importantly, none of you have significant political baggage that would make your employment impossible. The last point hung in the air. They all understood what it meant. They hadn't been SS, hadn't been involved in war crimes, hadn't been fanatic Nazis. They'd been professional soldiers, doing their duty as they understood it. And while that didn't absolve them of responsibility for serving an evil regime, it did mean they weren't irredeemable. What would this advisory group actually do? Ernst Weber asked. Analyze Soviet doctrine and capabilities, wargame scenarios for potential conflicts in Central Europe, evaluate the effectiveness of American and British equipment against Soviet systems, develop training materials for hypothetical German defensive forces, write technical assessments and tactical recommendations. It's staff work, analysis, planning, nothing operational, nothing that violates the terms of surrender. And in return, pay equivalent to your former ranks, housing for you and your families, access to better rations, protection from some of the harsher aspects of denazification, and most importantly, a role in shaping what comes next. Heinrich exchanged glances with the other officers. He could see the calculation happening behind each man's eyes. The offer was seductive, especially given how limited their options currently were. Former Wehrmacht officers were barely employable in civilian life, too tainted by association with the Nazi regime to be trusted with significant positions, too proud to accept menial labor, and too skilled in only one profession to easily transition to another.
But accepting this offer meant acknowledging that they had been defeated, that their knowledge and experience were valuable only in service to the victors. It meant working for the Americans, possibly against the Soviets, who had been their enemies but who now controlled half of Germany. It meant complicity in whatever Cold War was emerging from the ashes of the hot one. "I need to think about it," Heinrich said carefully. "We all do." "Of course," Mitchell said. He handed each of them a card with an address in Munich. "You have 1 week. Report to this location if you decide to accept. If you don't show up, we'll find others. There's no shortage of qualified candidates." "And if we refuse," Friedrich Hartmann asked, "no repercussions?" "None beyond continuing under current restrictions," Mitchell assured him. "This is a voluntary opportunity, not a conscription. We want people who choose to be there, who believe in what they're doing. Bitter, resentful employees would be worse than useless." The demonstration was over. American trucks were pulling away, leaving the burned-out hulks of German armor on the range, monuments to the technological leap that had made Heinrich's expertise suddenly obsolete and newly relevant all at once. As they walked back toward the transport that would return them to their temporary housing, Ernst Weber spoke quietly. "It's a trap, you realize. Once we start working for them, we're compromised. If Germany ever reunifies, if there's ever a government that wants to restore national pride, we'll be collaborators. If there's ever a government like that, it will mean we've learned nothing from the past 6 years.
The Third Reich is dead and good riddance. The question is, what comes next? What do you think, Heinrich? Friedrich Hartmann asked. As the most senior officer present and the one with the most extensive combat experience, Heinrich's opinion carried weight. Heinrich watched the last American truck disappear down the road. He thought about the M18 recoilless rifle, about how it represented not just a single weapon, but an entire approach to warfare, one that relied on technological superiority, industrial capacity, and tactical flexibility rather than ideological fervor and operational brilliance. He thought about the map Mitchell had shown them, with Soviet forces sitting deep in Germany, with the Western Allies preparing for a confrontation that might eventually require German participation. He said, "I think that Colonel Mitchell is right about one thing. The world has changed, and we can either adapt or become irrelevant. The question isn't whether we should work for the Americans. The question is whether we're working toward a future where Germany has any agency at all, or whether we're just choosing which foreign master to serve." "That's not much of an answer," Ernst said. "It's the only honest one I have. But I'm going to that address in Munich next week. What you do is your own decision." They rode the rest of the way in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. Heinrich stared out the truck's window at the German countryside, at the fields that were slowly recovering from years of neglect and battle damage, at the villages where people were trying to rebuild lives from rubble. Somewhere out there were his wife and daughter, living with his wife's parents because their apartment in Hamburg had been destroyed in the 1943 firebombing. He hadn't seen them in 3 months, couldn't visit them because travel was restricted for former military personnel. If he took Mitchell's offer, he would have greater freedom of movement, better resources to help his family, but he would also be committing himself to a path that might have unexpected consequences. The Americans were being friendly now, but they were occupiers, victors who could change their policies at any moment. And the Soviets, if they ever found out that former Wehrmacht officers were helping develop tactics to use against them, the retribution would be severe. Yet what choice did he really have? Sit idle while history happened around him? Try to find work as a clerk or laborer, pretending his skills and experience didn't exist? Join the millions of displaced persons wandering through Europe, hoping for a future that seemed increasingly distant? The M18 recoilless rifle had shown him something important. Germany had lost not just because of strategic mistakes or tactical errors, but because the Allies had deeper reserves of innovation, resources, and adaptability. They'd been able to develop weapons like the M18 in the middle of a massive war, deploy them, refine them, produce them in quantities that could make a strategic difference. If Germany was to have any future, it would need to learn from that. Not to prepare for another war. Heinrich had no illusions that Germany would be allowed to rearm significantly in his lifetime, but to understand how modern nations wielded power, how they combined technology, economics, and military force into something that could defeat even the most skilled tacticians and bravest soldiers. The truck pulled up to the displaced persons camp where they were housed, a former Wehrmacht barracks that had been repurposed to hold former military personnel awaiting processing through the denazification program. It was clean enough, better than many German civilians had, but it was still fundamentally a prison, a place where men who'd once commanded thousands waited in limbo while bureaucrats decided their fates.
Heinrich climbed down from the truck, returned the mandatory salute to the American guard at the gate, and walked to his assigned room. It was small, containing a bed, a chair, a desk, and a locker for personal possessions. He had few enough of those: a change of clothes, some letters from his wife, a photograph of his daughter taken before the war, when she'd been 6 years old. She was 13 now. Growing up in a defeated country, learning to live with shame and scarcity. He sat at the desk and pulled out paper and a pen. The letter to his wife would be read by censors, so he had to be careful how he phrased things. But she deserved to know that an opportunity had presented itself, that there might be a path forward from the stagnation they'd been living in. My dearest Anna, I hope this letter finds you and Greta well. I think of you both constantly and wish I could be there to help with the reconstruction of our lives. Something unexpected happened today that I need to share with you. I was invited to observe a demonstration of American military equipment. I cannot provide details, but what I saw made it clear that the war we fought was already lost before it began. Not because of any lack of courage or skill on our part, but because our opponents possessed industrial and technological advantages we could not match. I have been offered a position as a technical advisor, a civilian role that would allow me greater freedom of movement and better resources to support our family. The work would involve studying military developments and providing analysis. It is not a return to military service, but it would use my experience and training in a constructive way. I want your opinion on this before I make a decision. The offer is complicated. It comes from the Americans. It would mean working in support of their interests, and it might make our position in German society more difficult in the future. But it would also give us options we don't currently have, and it might help ensure that when Germany rebuilds, we do so with understanding of how the modern world actually works, rather than the illusions we lived under before. Please write back as soon as you can. I have 1 week to decide. Whatever we choose together. All my love, Heinrich. He sealed the letter and set it aside for the morning mail collection. Then he lay back on his bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the demonstration in his mind. The M18's distinctive double crack, the vapor trail of the projectile, the distance so much greater than what the Panzerfaust could achieve, the implications rippling out from that single technical innovation. In another room down the hall, Ernst Weber was having similar thoughts. The artillery captain sat at his own desk, his remaining hand working slowly to write notes in a journal he'd kept throughout the war. He was trying to work through the technical specifications Mitchell had provided, calculating firing solutions, plotting fields of fire, imagining how recoilless rifles would integrate with conventional artillery in a modern defensive scheme. The mathematics were compelling. The M18 filled the capability gap that artillery couldn't effectively address, the need for direct fire anti-armor engagement at medium ranges. Artillery could provide indirect fire support, could suppress enemy positions, could destroy soft targets. But against moving armor, artillery was inefficient, requiring massive ammunition expenditure for uncertain results. The M18 gave infantry units organic capability to defeat armor without calling for fire support, which meant more flexible defensive arrangements and faster response to enemy attacks. Ernst had spent the war learning that modern combat was about combining different weapon systems into mutually supporting networks. Machine guns to suppress infantry, mortars for local fire support, artillery for deep strikes and massed fires, anti-tank guns for armor defense. The M18 enhanced that network, made it more resilient, gave commanders more options. If the Soviets were developing their own recoilless rifles, and Mitchell's intelligence seemed reliable, then any future conflict in Central Europe would be shaped by these weapons. Understanding them wasn't optional, it was necessary for survival. Ernst had seen too many good soldiers die because their commanders didn't understand the weapons they faced. He wouldn't let that happen again if he had any say in the matter. He closed his journal and stood, walking to the small window that looked out over the camp. Other former soldiers were visible, going about their restricted lives, waiting for decisions from people who held their futures in bureaucratic hands. Some would adapt, would find new purposes. Others would simply fade, unable to let go of the past, unable to imagine a future different from what they'd known. Ernst knew which type he wanted to be. Friedrich Hartmann lay on his bunk, hands behind his head, wrestling with a different set of concerns. At 23, he was young enough that the war had consumed most of his adult life. He'd been 17 when Germany invaded Poland, 19 when he'd first gone to the Eastern Front as a junior lieutenant. The army had been his entire world, and now that world had vanished. The Panzerfaust training he'd conducted had saved lives, he was certain of that. By teaching men to use the weapon effectively, by drilling them until the actions became automatic, he'd given them tools to survive encounters with enemy armor. Some of his students had written to him after successful engagements, thanking him for training that had kept them alive. But he'd also sent men to their deaths. No amount of training could overcome the fundamental problem of the Panzerfaust's short range. To use it effectively, soldiers had to get close to tanks that were actively trying to kill them. Many of his students had died in the attempt, and Friedrich carried that weight. The M18 could have changed that equation. With proper training, soldiers could engage armor from positions that were relatively safe, could support each other from distance, could create defensive networks that didn't require suicidal courage. If Germany had possessed weapons like that earlier in the war, how many of his students would still be alive? It was a pointless question, of course. Germany hadn't had such weapons, and the past couldn't be changed. But the future could be shaped. If Friedrich accepted Mitchell's offer, he could help ensure that soldiers, whoever's soldiers they might be, had the training and doctrine they needed to use these new weapons effectively. He could take the lessons he'd learned about teaching complex skills under pressure and apply them to a new generation of defensive tactics. The question was whether he could stomach working for the Americans, the people who'd defeated his country. Friedrich hadn't been a Nazi. He joined the army because it was expected, because Germany was at war and every young man was needed. He'd fought because his unit depended on him, because the alternative was letting his comrades die. He'd never believed the propaganda about racial superiority or Lebensraum or the glorious destiny of the German people. But he'd still fought for an evil regime, still contributed to its war effort. The Americans didn't make distinctions about motivation. They judged people by actions, not intentions. If he worked for them now, would he be betraying the men who died under his instruction? Or would he be honoring their memory by ensuring their sacrifices led to better doctrine, better training, better chances for future soldiers? Friedrich didn't have an answer, but he knew he had a week to find one. Klaus Dietrich's approach was more pragmatic. The Panzer commander had survived 3 tank destructions by being practical, by assessing situations clearly and acting decisively. Sentiment was a luxury that got people killed. Clear thinking kept them alive. The offer from the Americans was straightforward. Work for them in exchange for better conditions and a role in shaping future military developments. The risks were political, potential stigma if German attitudes shifted against collaboration. The benefits were immediate and concrete. Better support for his family, freedom of movement, meaningful work. Klaus had no particular loyalty to the Americans, But he had no reason to oppose them either. They'd won the war fair and square through superior resources and better organization. The idea of German military superiority had been revealed as a myth. Oh, individual German units had been excellent. Tactical victories had been achieved. Brilliant operations had been executed. But none of it had mattered in the face of industrial might and strategic patience. The Soviets were a different matter. Klaus had fought them for 3 years, from the initial invasion in 1941 to the desperate defense of Germany in 1945. He'd seen what Soviet occupation looked like in territory they captured and recaptured. He'd spoken with refugees, seen the fear in their eyes when they talked about NKVD troops and commissars. If the choice was between American occupation and Soviet domination, Klaus would take the Americans every time. They were more humane, less ideological, more interested in economic recovery than revolutionary transformation. Working for them wasn't ideal, but it was survivable. And survival was Klaus's primary skill. He would accept Mitchell's offer, not out of any grand sense of purpose or desire for redemption, but because it was the smart play given current circumstances. The others might agonize over principles and implications. Klaus would make the practical choice and adjust as circumstances required. That had kept him alive through the war. It would serve him well in whatever came next. The week passed slowly. Heinrich received a reply from his wife, brief and carefully worded to pass censorship, but clear in its message. Whatever you think is right, I will support. We trust your judgment. Come home to us when you can. She'd left a decision to him, as he'd known she would. Anna had always been practical about military life, understood that soldiers made difficult choices in impossible circumstances. She wouldn't second-guess him now. On the appointed day, Heinrich dressed in his best civilian clothes, which weren't very good, but they were clean and pressed, and made his way to Munich. The address Mitchell had provided was in the American sector, a former German administrative building that had been taken over by occupation forces. Security was tight. Heinrich had to pass through multiple checkpoints, show his identification repeatedly, be searched twice. Inside, he found Ernst Weber and Klaus Dietrich waiting in a reception area. Friedrich Hartmann arrived 10 minutes later, looking nervous but determined. "So, we all decided the same way?" Ernst observed. "Or we're all equally desperate," Klaus replied with a slight smile. A door opened, and Colonel Mitchell appeared, looking pleased. "Gentlemen, welcome. I'm glad you came. Let me show you what we're building here." He led them through the building, past offices where American personnel worked on various administrative tasks, to a secured section in the rear. The door required a key and a combination to open. Inside was a large room set up as a combination conference area and technical library, with maps on the walls, filing cabinets marked with security classifications, and tables covered with documents and photographs. 3 other men were already there, former Wehrmacht officers Heinrich recognized from service records and reputation. There was Colonel Walter Grimm, who'd commanded a Panzer division in Normandy. Major Peter Scholl, an intelligence officer who'd worked on Eastern Front threat assessments, and Captain Ludwig Brenner, an engineer who'd specialized in fortifications and defensive systems. "This is the initial team," Mitchell said. 7 of you to start, though we may expand based on workload. Your official title will be Military Technical Advisors to the European Command Historical Section. In practice, you'll be our Soviet specialists, helping us understand what we're facing in Eastern Europe and how to prepare for potential conflict. Heinrich studied the maps with growing comprehension. Red markers indicated Soviet tank divisions, mechanized infantry, artillery concentrations. Blue markers showed American and British forces, spread thinner, relying on mobility and technology rather than mass. The disparity in numbers was sobering. The Soviets had at least 3 times as many divisions in position. Your first assignment, Mitchell continued, is to wargame a Soviet offensive through the Fulda Gap. Assume they achieve tactical surprise. Assume they commit 4 tank armies supported by tactical aviation. How long until they reach the Rhine? What defensive measures would be most effective? What equipment and doctrine would NATO forces need to have any chance of stopping them? Friedrich Hartmann leaned forward, tracing the gap on the map with his finger. The Fulda Gap was always the obvious route: flat terrain, good road network, direct path to Frankfurt and the Rhine crossings. But NATO has what, maybe 10 divisions to cover the entire front? 12 if we mobilize reserves, Mitchell said, against approximately 40 Soviet divisions in the first echelon alone, with another 40 in operational reserve. Then NATO loses, Klaus Dietrich said bluntly. 4-to-1 odds, with the Soviets having operational initiative? The mathematics are simple. You'd need to attrit their forces at an unsustainable rate just to slow them down. Which brings us back to weapons like the M18, Ernst Weber interjected, as his mind already worked through the problem. If every NATO squad has organic anti-armor capability, if defensive positions are prepared in depth with mutually supporting fields of fire, if tactical aviation can interdict follow-on forces, then you're still losing, Klaus interrupted, just more slowly. Attrition favors the side with greater numbers, unless the technology gap is enormous. Is it? Mitchell pulled out another folder, this one marked with higher security classifications. That's what we need you to help us determine. We have intelligence on Soviet equipment development, their version of the recoilless rifle, their new tank designs, their tactical aviation improvements. We need you to evaluate whether American and British weapons can offset the numerical advantage. And if they can't, we need recommendations on what would be required. Heinrich felt the old familiar sensation of command decisions, the weight of lives depending on accurate assessments. But this was different. These were theoretical lives, hypothetical battles, plans for wars that might never happen, or might happen tomorrow if Stalin decided to push west. We'll need access to American equipment specifications, Heinrich said. Not just the M18, but everything: tanks, aircraft, artillery, infantry weapons. We need to understand the full technological picture. You'll have it, Mitchell assured him. Within security limitations, obviously. Some things remain classified even from advisors, but you'll have enough to do serious analysis. Over the following weeks, the team immersed themselves in their new role. The work was intellectually demanding in ways that field command never had been. In combat, decisions were made with incomplete information, under time pressure. Here they had abundant information and could analyze it methodically, building detailed assessments of capabilities and vulnerabilities. Heinrich focused on defensive doctrine, working with Ernst to design integrated defensive schemes that combined the M18 recoilless rifle with conventional artillery and infantry tactics. They developed concepts for mobile reserves, for fighting withdrawals that would attrit Soviet forces while preserving NATO combat power, for creating killing zones where Soviet armor would be channeled into prepared fields of fire. Friedrich wrote training materials, translating technical specifications into practical instruction that could be used to train American and British soldiers. His experience as a Panzerfaust instructor proved invaluable. He understood how to break complex skills into teachable components, how to design training progressions that built competence systematically. Klaus became their specialist on Soviet operational art, drawing on his experience fighting Soviet forces to predict how they would employ their new equipment. He'd faced Soviet tank armies during their great offensives of 1944, understood their approach to breakthrough operations, their willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of operational objectives. Peter Scholl, the intelligence officer, coordinated information flow, ensuring they had current data on Soviet deployments and activities. Ludwig Brenner worked on fortification designs, creating blueprints for defensive positions optimized for the new weapons. Colonel Grimm, the most senior officer, served as their liaison to Mitchell and the broader American command structure. The work was satisfying in unexpected ways. They were using their skills and experience constructively, contributing to planning that might prevent future conflicts rather than fighting them. The pay was adequate, the conditions were better than what most Germans currently endured, and gradually they were able to bring their families to better housing in the American sector. Heinrich was finally able to visit Anna and Greta. The reunion was emotional. 3 months of separation, seeing his daughter grown taller, his wife aged by worry and hardship. They moved into a small apartment in Munich, modest by pre-war standards, but palatial compared to what most Germans had. Greta enrolled in school, Anna found work helping with administrative tasks for the occupation authority, and slowly their life began to feel almost normal. But normalcy was an illusion, sustained by pretending the world wasn't balanced on a knife's edge. In early 1946, Winston Churchill delivered his Iron Curtain speech at Westminster College in Missouri. The words resonated across Europe. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. The wartime alliance was dead, replaced by ideological confrontation and mutual suspicion. Heinrich and his colleagues watched events unfold with the peculiar perspective of men standing between worlds. They worked for the Americans, but lived among Germans, understood Soviet capabilities, but served Western interests. They were neither fish nor fowl, trusted by neither side completely, but useful to both. The technical work continued. By mid-1946, they'd produced comprehensive assessments of Soviet offensive capabilities, detailed recommendations for NATO defensive preparations, and training materials that were being adopted by American units in Germany. The M18 recoilless rifle became standard equipment for infantry companies, exactly as they had recommended. Defensive positions were being prepared along likely Soviet invasion routes, incorporating the mutually supporting fire schemes Heinrich and Ernst had designed. But the deeper they delved into the calculations, the more sobering the conclusions became. One evening, working late in their secured office, Heinrich laid out the results of their latest war game. Ernst and Klaus studied the map in silence, following the markers that showed projected Soviet advances over days and weeks.
"Even with everything we've recommended," Heinrich said quietly, "even with recoilless rifles in every squad, with prepared defenses, with tactical aviation, with perfect execution, NATO holds for maybe 3 weeks before the Rhine is compromised." 3 weeks if we're lucky, Klaus corrected. If the Soviets achieve surprise, if their initial breakthrough succeeds, it could be 10 days. Ernst traced supply routes with his remaining hand. "The problem is cumulative. Each defensive line we prepare costs resources. Each position requires troops to man it. NATO doesn't have the depth to trade space for time the way the Soviets did during the German invasion. From the inner German border to the Rhine is only 200 kilometers. At Soviet operational tempo, that's less than a week if resistance collapses." "So we tell Mitchell that his defensive strategy is fundamentally flawed?" Friedrich asked from across the room, where he'd been listening while reviewing training materials. "We tell him the truth," Heinrich said, "that defensive preparations buy time, not victory. That if the Soviets attack with full commitment, NATO will need reinforcements from America, will need to mobilize reserves, will need to accept that the initial phase of any conflict will be a fighting withdrawal." The report they submitted was classified at the highest levels, but Heinrich heard later that it caused significant discussion in Washington and London. The comfortable assumption that American technology could offset Soviet numbers was being challenged by men who'd faced those numbers firsthand and understood their implications. In response, military spending increased. More divisions were allocated to Germany. NATO was formally established as a collective defense organization. The Marshall Plan pumped resources into European recovery, strengthening economies that would need to support military forces. And development began on new weapon systems, tactical nuclear weapons, advanced tanks, improved aircraft.
The shadow of another war grew longer. By 1948, Heinrich had been working as an advisor for nearly 3 years. The team had expanded, now including specialists in logistics, communications, and combined arms operations. They'd produced dozens of studies, trained hundreds of American officers on Soviet tactics, and contributed to the formation of what would become NATO's defensive doctrine for Central Europe. But Heinrich felt increasingly uneasy about where this was heading. The work was necessary, he believed that. Understanding Soviet capabilities, preparing defenses, maintaining deterrence through readiness, all of that made sense. But there was a momentum to it, a logic that pushed toward confrontation rather than resolution. One day, Colonel Mitchell called Heinrich into his office alone. The American had been promoted to full colonel, recognition of his work establishing the advisory program. His face was graver than Heinrich had seen before. "We've received intelligence that the Soviets are accelerating their military production. New tank designs, improved artillery, more recoilless rifles than we anticipated. They're building an offensive capability that goes beyond what would be needed for defensive purposes. They faced the Wehrmacht. They learned the same lessons we're teaching you, that modern warfare requires combined arms, deep operations, overwhelming force at the point of decision. Of course they're building offensive capability. That's how they think about security. Which means the calculation you gave us in 1946 is already outdated. If we wargame a Soviet offensive in 1950 instead of 1946, what do we get?" Heinrich knew the answer without running new scenarios. Less time. Maybe 2 weeks to the Rhine instead of 3. Maybe less if they employ their new equipment effectively. Mitchell nodded slowly. "That's what our analysts concluded. Which means we need to revise our entire defensive concept, which means more resources, more troops, more preparation for a war that might come any day." "Or never," Heinrich said. "Colonel, we've been doing this for 3 years. Every assessment shows the Soviets getting stronger. Every response involves NATO building up forces. Every action provokes reaction. We're creating exactly the conditions that make war more likely." "Are you suggesting we should stop preparing defenses?" Mitchell asked sharply. "I'm suggesting we're trapped in a calculation that has no good ending. The Soviets see NATO build up and increase their own forces. NATO sees increases and responds with more troops. Each side's security measures become the other side's threat. And somewhere in this spiral, someone makes a miscalculation, and we're all back at war." Mitchell leaned back in his chair, studying Heinrich carefully. "You've changed since 1945. The man who came to watch the M18 demonstration was defeated, looking for purpose. Now you sound like a philosopher questioning the entire enterprise. 3 years of calculating how wars might be fought does that. Every scenario we wargame ends in devastation, even the ones where NATO wins. Where Soviet offensives are stopped, where counterattacks succeed, the cost is millions of casualties, and Central Europe reduced to rubble again. So what's the alternative? Surrender to Soviet expansion?"
"I don't know," Heinrich admitted. "But I know that what we're doing, the endless preparations, the competitive build-up, the assumption that military force is the answer to every security problem, this is the same logic that led to the last war. Different ideologies, different players, but the same fundamental failure to find security through anything other than threats." Mitchell was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer. "You're not wrong, but you're also not naive enough to think the Soviets would stop building forces if we did. Some problems don't have good solutions, only less bad ones." "I know," Heinrich said, "which is why I'm still here, still doing this work. Because even if the underlying problem is insoluble, the calculations still matter. If war comes, being prepared means fewer people die. That's worth something." "It's worth everything," Mitchell agreed. "And for what it's worth, the work you've done has probably prevented war more than once. Stalin knows NATO is prepared. knows that any offensive would be costly, even if ultimately successful. That knowledge creates caution, which creates space for diplomacy. Heinrich left the meeting feeling no more resolved, but perhaps more accepting of the ambiguity. He was doing useful work in service of uncertain goals, helping prepare for wars that might never happen, to prevent outcomes that would be catastrophic if they did. There was no moral clarity in it, no sense of righteous purpose, but there was craft and professionalism and the hope that expertise might make some small difference. That evening, he sat with Anna on the small balcony of their apartment, watching the lights of Munich come on as dusk settled over the city. Greta was inside doing homework, their daughter now 15 and already making plans for university, talking about studying medicine or perhaps architecture to help rebuild Germany. "Do you ever regret accepting Mitchell's offer?" Anna asked, as if reading his thoughts. "Every day, and never. I regret being part of this machinery of preparation for war. But I'm proud of the work we do, proud that our analysis might save lives if the worst happens. The two things coexist." "That's very German," Anna said with a slight smile. Philosophical angst about moral ambiguity. "What would be very American?" Heinrich asked, amused despite himself. "Pragmatic confidence that you're doing the right thing," Anna said. "Mitchell and his colleagues don't seem to lose sleep over moral complexity." "Oh, they do. They just hide it better. Mitchell knows the problems with what we're building. He just believes there's no alternative, so the only choice is to execute it as well as possible." Anna took his hand. "And you? What do you believe?" Heinrich thought about the M18 recoilless rifle, about the demonstrations that had seemed so impressive in 1945, about how that weapon was already being superseded by better designs, more powerful systems, more sophisticated technology. He thought about the calculations they ran, showing that each advance in weapons technology made war simultaneously less likely and more catastrophic. He thought about Greta, growing up in a world balanced between uneasy peace and potential annihilation. "I believe," he said slowly, "that we're all trapped in the iron echo, the reverberations of past wars shaping how we prepare for future ones, the logic of military competition driving toward destinations nobody wants. But I also believe that understanding that trap is better than being unconscious in it. And maybe, just maybe, if enough people understand the calculations, the costs, the fundamental insanity of it all, we might find a way to break the cycle." "That's very optimistic," Anna observed. "Is it? Or is it just the minimum hope necessary to keep working?" She squeezed his hand. "Perhaps both." Inside, they could hear Greta practicing piano. Chopin, the music that had been forbidden during the war because of its Polish origins, now being played freely by a German girl who'd never known anything but defeat, an occupation, and slow reconstruction. The music was beautiful, a reminder that not everything humans created was weapons and walls and calculations of destruction. Heinrich listened to his daughter play and thought about the paradox of his position. He was a former enemy now employed by victors, using his expertise in war to help prevent wars, trapped in a system he recognized as flawed, but unable to imagine a better alternative. He traded the uniform of the Wehrmacht for civilian clothes that marked him as something neither fully German nor fully American, neither warrior nor pacifist, neither villain nor hero. Just a man trying to use his skills responsibly in a world that made responsibility complicated. The Chopin piece concluded, and in the moment of silence before Greta started another, Heinrich made his peace with the contradictions. The work would continue. The calculations would be refined, the preparations would expand, the hope that deterrence would hold would be tested again and again. And through it all, people like him would do their best to make the madness slightly less mad, knowing it would never be enough, but that the alternative, giving up, refusing to engage, pretending the problems didn't exist, would be worse.
In the end, perhaps that was all anyone could do. Understand the trap, work within its constraints, hope for wisdom to eventually transcend it, and meanwhile, play Chopin in the gathering darkness, creating beauty despite everything. The Iron Echo would continue resonating through history. But maybe, Heinrich thought, maybe its reverberations would eventually fade, replaced by something better, something wiser, something that remembered war well enough to avoid repeating it. He could hope for that much. Some days, hope was enough. Major General Heinrich Steiner, retired, stood in front of the television, watching in disbelief as young Germans climbed atop the Berlin Wall, swinging sledgehammers and pickaxes, tearing down the barrier that had divided their city for 28 years. His wife Anna sat beside him, tears streaming down her face. Their daughter Greta, now a successful architect, had called from Berlin, where she was witnessing the moment firsthand. "Papa," she said, her voice breaking with emotion, "it's over. The Cold War is over. The wall is coming down." Heinrich had spent 44 years preparing for a war that never came. The calculations, the war games, the defensive schemes, all of it had been both necessary and, in the end, never tested. NATO and the Warsaw Pact had stared at each other across the inner German border for 4 decades, building enough weapons to destroy civilization several times over. And somehow, impossibly, no one had pulled the trigger. "Did we do it right?" he asked Heinrich quietly, watching the celebrations on screen. She said, "You kept the peace. All those years, all that work, it created a balance terrible enough that no one dared disturb it. Maybe that's the only way it could have ended. Maybe the Iron Echo had to reverberate until everyone was so exhausted by its sound that they chose silence instead." Heinrich thought about Colonel Mitchell, long since retired, about his German colleagues who'd spent careers in the shadow of preparation for war, about the millions of soldiers on both sides who'd trained and waited and never fought, about the weapons that never had been fired in anger, the battles that never had been fought, the casualties that never had happened. Maybe that was victory. Not the glorious triumph his younger self had imagined, but the quiet success of a disaster averted, of a calculation that held just long enough for circumstances to change. On screen, the people of Berlin danced on the wall, and Heinrich allowed himself to believe that maybe, finally, the echo was fading. Thank you for joining me on this epic journey through the Iron Echo. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the complex moral calculations of the Cold War era, or if you simply enjoyed the narrative, I would be incredibly grateful if you could hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support makes it possible for me to continue creating these immersive, novel-length stories that explore the human dimensions of historical events. Share this video with history enthusiasts, with anyone who appreciates thoughtful storytelling, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our next deep dive narrative. The stories we tell shape how we understand our past and imagine our future. Let's explore them together. Until next time, thank you for listening.